how bad is it to conduct medical experiments on a 9-month-old baby? Does it make sense to risk one human, and that too an infant, to some horrible experiments, hoping for a breakthrough that can benefit millions of humans? Some would say that it makes sense. Humans are also animals. When animals can be used for research to benefit humans, what is wrong with using humans for the same? There is a thin line, which to be honest is not that thin for many. Most, however, will argue that since it is a matter of an infant who cannot give consent, that it is totally out of line. Humans should not be listed with all the other animals. They are a different species. To settle the debate, and have you think about it with a context, we have today a very famous psychological experiment from the aging pages of scientific history. The experiment was conducted at Johns Hopkins University between 1919 and 1920 by John B. Watson and his assistant Rosalie Rayner. Watson was an American psychologist who was often referred to as the father of behaviorism. Watson was the man behind this iconic experiment, which was the first of its kind, but also a huge question mark on the ethics of research. John B. Watson was born on January 9, 1878, and grew up in South Carolina. John B. Watson was born into a strict Christian family, but his teenage years were marked by turmoil. He had to start working at an early age, in addition to experiencing violence and neglect at home. When his alcoholic father left the family, Watson became apathetic towards religion. That is when his views about the world and the people began to develop. The family later relocated to Greenville, South Carolina, where Watson got exposure to different kinds of people for the first time in his life. His views, psychology, and the way of looking at the world had already taken a certain turn. Despite his early struggles, Watson gained admission to Furman University in Greenville at the young age of 16. However, his time at university was challenging. He had to juggle multiple jobs to support himself and did not excel academically. Because he always struggled with communication and people, his peers thought of him as antisocial, weird, and incapable. Watson persevered and earned a master's degree at the age of 21. He later gained admission to the prestigious University of Chicago, where he continued his studies in psychology. It was at Chicago University that Watson's career began to take a more positive turn. He was mentored by renowned psychologist John Dewey and became increasingly interested in behaviorism, a new approach to psychology that emphasized observable behavior over internal mental processes. Watson was a strong protagonist of behaviorism. He believed that behavior and attitude can tell a lot and can be used as a therapy and solution to so many issues with humans. Psychology before his time was mostly based on introspection, that is, looking at a person as a subject and using his history and upbringing as a tool. Watson's groundbreaking research and theories laid the foundation for behaviorism and revolutionized the field of psychology. Despite the fact that his controversial experiment, the Little Albert, has been subject to severe backlash, his service to the field of psychology cannot be denied. In 1902, Watson completed his PhD while serving as a research professor at the University of Chicago. 6 years later, in 1908, he embraced a faculty position at Johns Hopkins University, swiftly ascending to the chair of the psychology department. Shortly after assuming this role, Watson continued to delve into behaviorism, culminating in his seminal 1913 paper titled Psychology as the Behaviorist Views It. In this paper, Watson shared the central tenets of behaviorism, advocating for the study of behavior by solely examining observable behaviors and events. He argued that these actions were influenced by external stimuli and an individual's history of learned behavior through reinforcement or punishment. At that time, other psychologists were working on the human brain as a subject that can be studied. Watson, for the first time, postulated that internal mental state does not have to do with a person and his makeup as much as his environment has. This means that any human being can be made into an individual of preferred and desirable qualities. Despite encountering initial skepticism from the broader scientific community, behaviorism gradually gained recognition as a legitimate field of study. In 1915, Watson assumed the role of president of the American Psychological Association, solidifying his influence and impact within the field. All of his achievements and the events of his personal life help us understand what led Watson to conduct that notorious experiment and do horrible things to an infant. Rayner, Watson's assistant, received her bachelor's and master's degree from Vassar College and went on to work as an assistant in Watson's laboratory at Johns Hopkins University. Both the psychologist and his assistant are known for their controversial experiment with a 9-month-old infant, and were destined to go down in history for the same reputation. Watson had some really objectionable views regarding childbearing, such as he believed that from infanthood, a child should be sensitized and conditioned to desirable stimuli. In this way, he could be made into a person of one's desires and preferences. These views were probably the reason why he very comfortably used an infant for his series of experiments related to his favorite subject. That was behaviorism, and that too for several months. These experiments were to be a felony if conducted in the present times. Watson and Rayner conducted the little Albert experiment to answer 3 questions mainly. Number 1. Can an infant be conditioned to fear an animal that appears simultaneously with a loud, fear-arousing sound? Number 2. Would such fear transfer to other animals or inanimate objects? And number 3. How long would such fears persist? The experiment was inspired by Pavlov, who was gaining insane fame for his theories about animal conditioning. Watson was intrigued by the results and wanted to see if the same worked on humans. He decided to take it up a notch. History has preserved his exciting experiment till now as a prime example of what not to do while conducting an experiment. The participant in the experiment was a child that Watson and Rayner called Albert B, but is known popularly today as Little Albert. Albert was born to a wet nurse who lived on the Johns Hopkins campus. Can you guess what amount she got paid for her baby's participation in the study? $1. After gaining permission from Albert's mother for $1, which was quite a sum in those days, mind you, the researchers decided to test the process of classical conditioning on a human subject by inducing fears and phobias in the child. The baseline session occurred when Albert was approximately 9 months old to test his reactions to neutral stimuli. Watson and Rayner exposed him to a series of stimuli including a white rat, a rabbit, a monkey, masks with and without hair, cotton wool, and burning newspapers, and observed the boy's reactions. The boy initially showed no fear of any of the objects he was shown. The next time Albert was exposed to the rat, Watson made a loud noise by hitting a metal pipe with a hammer. Naturally, the child began to cry after hearing the loud noise. Watson did the same 7 times, with an interval of 1 week between the consecutive ones. Each time, Albert would burst into tears, start crawling away rapidly, or just withdraw from the noise. After repeatedly pairing the white rat with the loud noise, Albert began to expect a frightening noise whenever he saw the white rat. Soon, Albert began to cry simply after seeing the rat. Watson and Rayner wrote, "The instant the rat was shown, the baby began to cry. Almost instantly, he turned sharply to the left, fell over on his left side, raised himself on all fours, and began to crawl away so rapidly that he was caught with difficulty before reaching the edge of the table." In addition to demonstrating that emotional responses could be conditioned in humans, Watson and Rayner also observed that stimulus generalization had occurred. After conditioning, Albert feared not just the white rat, but a wide variety of similar white objects as well. His fear included other furry objects, including Rayner's fur coat and Watson wearing a Santa Claus beard. Although this generalization was not that simple, Watson and Rayner refreshed the fear by repeating the same experiment. They would present the white rat and then make the loud noise of a hammer hitting the steel. This would bring back the conditioned fear of white rats in the baby. In this experiment, a previously unafraid baby was conditioned to become afraid of a rat. It also demonstrates 2 additional concepts that were originally explained by Pavlov in relation to animals, but this time Watson and Rayner had proved them on humans. These 2 additional concepts were extinction and generalization. Although a conditioned association can be incredibly strong initially, it begins to fade if not reinforced, until it disappears completely. This phenomenon is called extinction. Conditioned associations can often widen beyond the specific stimuli presented. For instance, if a child develops a negative association with one teacher, this association might also be made with others. This phenomenon is known as generalization. Over the next few weeks and months, little Albert was observed, and 10 days after conditioning, his fear of the rat was much less marked. This dying out of a learned response is what we call extinction. However, even after a full month, it was still evident that the association could be renewed by repeating the original procedure a few times. You can see that the findings of the experiment are quite vague. There could be several factors blinding the results. For instance, the age of the baby and his vulnerability to sounds and colors. Fortunately, or unfortunately, Albert's mother withdrew him from the experiment the day the last tests were made, and Watson and Rayner were unable to conduct further experiments to reverse the conditioned response. Or probably she did not withdraw. The agreement had been completed that day, and she just left. This was actually the ethical basis of the experiment. Watson and Rayner were supposed to decondition the infant after completing their experiments, but they never got the time or opportunity to. At least, that is what the publications say. Reality looks quite the opposite. If it had been promised that the experimenters would decondition the child to reverse the psychological trauma induced by the procedure, why did the mother leave right after the last day of experiments? Another question that has emerged several times in the literature, and more so in our minds, is that where did the little Albert go? What happened to little Albert? What were the consequences of the experiment on the subject as he grew up? These are some very important questions, answers to which unfortunately are not available. And this is one of the reasons why this experiment is known less for its results and findings, and more for its unethical take. In the later years, the true identity and fate of the boy known as little Albert was discovered. Psychologists had since been intrigued by the rest of the story. What happened to little Albert after the experiments? What kind of person did he grow up to be? As reported in American Psychologist, a 7-year search led by psychologist Hall P. Beck led to the discovery. You can imagine the curiosity. This psychologist, along with many others, conducted the search for 7 long years. After tracking down and locating the original experiments and the real identity of the boy's mother, it was suggested that little Albert was actually a boy named Douglas Mariette. The story does not have a happy ending, though. Douglas died at the age of 6 on May 10, 1925, of hydrocephalus, a buildup of fluid in his brain, which he had suffered from since birth. Our search of 7 years was longer than the little boy's life, Beck wrote of the discovery. In 2014, doubt was cast over Beck and Fridlund's findings, when researchers presented evidence that a boy by the name of William Barger was the real little Albert. Barger was born on the same day as Mariette to a wet nurse who worked at the same hospital as Mariette's mother. While his first name was William, he was known his entire life by his middle name, Albert. Not much was discovered even after recovering the possible identities of little Albert. The experiment remains relevant to this day because it clearly emphasizes the moral and ethical lines of research. We should mention here that the experiment conducted on the infant was not very fruitful either. An infant was subject to stimuli that could have ended him having phobias and permanent fears, or he could simply get injured during the experiment. If that were to happen, at least the experiment could have been designed in a way that it reaps optimum and useful results. The experiment was poorly conducted, without a clear objective or even a control subject. And this aspect of the experiment always gets overlooked because of its general popularity for various other reasons. Was such a weakly executed experiment with no useful objective worth risking a human infant? There were significant errors in the experiment if we put these ethical issues aside. The study didn't control for pseudo-conditioning. The loud noise may have simply sensitized Albert to be fearful of any novel stimulus. Every time he would hear the noise, he used to cry and get irritated. Going through that several times sensitized the baby. So, whenever he experienced any stimulus, whether conditioned or unconditioned, he would react the same way. It didn't control for maturation. Albert was initially 9 months old, but the final tests was at 12 months. Fears emerge naturally over time in infants, so maturation could account for Albert's reactions. Some doubts exist as to whether or not this fear response was actually a phobia. When Albert was allowed to suck his thumb, he showed no response whatsoever. The stimulus made him forget about the loud sound. It took more than 30 times for Watson to finally take Albert's thumb out to observe a fear response. Again, we cannot be sure if the experiment was as simple as the loud noise conditioning the baby. Other limitations included no control subject and no objective measurement of the fear response in little Albert. There's no way to tell if another baby without the conditioning experienced fear under new stimuli. As this was an experiment by one individual, the findings cannot be generalized to others. That is, the experiment has very low external validity and relevance. Albert had been reared in a hospital environment from birth, and he was unusual as he had never been seen to show fear or rage by staff. Therefore, little Albert may have responded differently in this experiment to how other young children may have. These findings will be therefore unique to him. Now, coming to the elephant in the room, the ethical issues that made this psychological experiment one of the most questionable studies in history. no informed consent was obtained from Albert's parents. They were misled about the true aims of the research and did not know their child would be intentionally frightened. This represents a lack of transparency and a violation of personal autonomy. The mother was only asked for her baby's participation, and the father was nowhere to be seen during the entire duration of the experiment. We never found any written consent from the mother. Neither is anybody sure about what the mother was and was not aware of. Intentionally inducing a fear response in an infant is concerning from a non-maleficence perspective, as it involves deliberate psychological harm. The distress exhibited by Albert suggests the conditioning procedure was unethical by today's standards, even by the standards then, if only they had any. Watson and Rayner did not attempt to decondition or desensitize Albert to the fear response before the study ended abruptly. This meant they did not remove the psychological trauma they had induced, violating the principle of beneficence. Little Albert remains one of the first experiments taught to psychologists, but his identity and what happened to him in the coming years remain a mystery in which psychologists are very interested. Paperwork and documentation had not been preserved effectively, which made it difficult to track down little Albert, and this made the experiment a perpetual enigma. The whole experiment might be taught in a psychology class, but it is equally important as a crime documentary. A human infant cannot give consent, agree or disagree with volunteering, which makes him out of the question as a subject for an experiment. Humans have developed this whole planet. They cannot be just any other animal that lacks cognition, culture, technology, emotional intelligence, and communication. So ethical and moral responsibilities are heavy when it comes to humans. What do you have to say about this? Share with us in the comments section.